Hi, everyone. My name is Adam Chang, and I'm here today with Stephanie Wildman and Margalynne Armstrong. Their book is Privilege Revealed: How Invisible Preference Undermines America, which was first published in 1996. I'm going to take a moment to give us all an introduction, welcome our panelists. And today we mark the release of a new and updated edition celebrating the book, but grappling with the fact that many of the issues raised 25 years ago remain so relevant. Also on the panel is John Powell, head of the Othering and Belonging Institute. Special thanks from all the panelists to John, Cecily Saraski, and Sarah Grossman at OBI for hosting this event and making it happen. And I want to kind of say hi to everybody. Professor Wildman served as director of Santa Clara Law School's Center for Social Justice and Public Service before becoming Professor Emerita. Her debut children's book, Brave in the Water, comes out this month. She has authored dozens of law review articles and journalistic pieces. She is a grandmother, mother, spouse, and a dear friend to many. Hi, Professor Wildman. Professor Armstrong is an associate professor at Santa Clara University School of Law. She teaches race and law, critical race theory, constitutional law, property law, and other courses. Her scholarship examines housing discrimination, race and criminal law, and teaching about race and privilege. Hello, Professor Armstrong. And lastly, it's my pleasure to welcome Professor John Powell, internationally recognized expert in areas of civil rights, civil liberties, structural racism, housing, poverty, and democracy. John is the director of the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley, a research institute that brings together scholars, community advocates, communicators, and policymakers to eliminate the barriers to an inclusive, just, and sustainable society. And welcome, John.
Thank you, Adam.
The topic of the hour is privilege. What is it, who has it, and what's to be done about it? Our goal today is to share examples of modern-day privilege and how they continue to uphold long-standing structures of racism and other forms of oppression. We also hope to spend some time discussing what allyship and coalition building looks like. Stick with us to the end, and our panel will also answer direct questions from the audience. And if you're posting live on social media today, please continue to use the hashtag AskOBI so that we can track the conversations. And if you're interested in purchasing the book, Privilege Revealed, visit nyupress.org, and you'll receive 30% off with the code PRIVILEGE30. It's all one word, and that's up on the screen for you as well. So let's delve in. Privilege Reveal holds this premise that we are all racist. This is not meant to be controversial. I'm not sparking a debate right now. But as Professor Wildman and Armstrong note, the sooner we come to this realization, the quicker we can address actionable steps towards positive change. And note that this recognition of our own racism doesn't mean that we all act with intentional bad thoughts or actions. In fact, modern racism is often so embedded in our structures that it feels hidden. But even if racism is not intentional, the ripple effect results in ongoing hardships for people of color. Add on that as historically marginalized people achieve greater levels of access, representation, and opportunity, privilege becomes that much harder to see, particularly white privilege. I want to quickly model what self-examination of privilege can look like. The book gives examples of how Blacks sometimes perform whiteness in predominantly white spaces. It made me think of how my own community adopts a kind of normative or performed whiteness in order to succeed. In what ways has my family and I performed whiteness while subverting our unique original selves? I think of numerous personal examples, how all of my first generation Asian American relatives adopted a white name: Eddie, Tony, Janet, Susan, Michael, Christina. Their Burmese and Chinese names were no longer on any formal papers whatsoever, not on government IDs, not on any parent-teacher school forms. And how I also encouraged my own father to give my siblings a white name, quoting and realizing that job opportunities down the line might be easily more accessible if they did this. My community's value on being light-skinned because it denotes higher standards of beauty and wealth. My mother moving in with her new white boyfriend when I was 8 years old, now my stepfather, who I love, how I was told not to speak, though, my native language, not to eat with chopsticks. These were lessons on how to fit in with my new white family. In the wake of #StopAsianHate, Headlines over the past week include Governor Mike Huckabee sarcastically claiming that he should identify as Chinese to avoid being canceled, and a Texas middle school teacher put on administrative leave after writing a social studies quiz asking their students if it's common practice in China to eat cats and dogs. Where is the privilege in their behavior? Can you spot it? If you can't quite name it, but your gut is telling you there's something wrong here, you're on the right path. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge that Asian Americans are really hurting right now. I've had really intense conversations with my siblings, my dear friends, and after the Atlanta shooting and spike in Asian hate crimes amidst the pandemic, Forbes reports that Asian Americans are purchasing more guns. On social media, Asian American celebrities are calling for increased Hollywood representation. Professionals are calling for more Asian representation on corporate boards. Suburban communities are calling for increased policing. And many advocates are requesting harsher penalties in one of the highest carceral countries in the world. I'll be direct in sharing that in my years of coalition building, these changes are not necessarily my priority areas for other communities, and some even run counter to the goals of communities of color. I hope that my community looks at both established and newly formed coalitions combating racism, targeting Asians with a lens of privilege, the privilege lens, and that we interrogate the remedies that we're seeking. Examining privilege allows us to recognize how efforts intended to promote inclusivity can contribute to marginalization. Phrased another way, unexamined privilege can result in counterproductive efforts when trying to build coalitions. With a privilege lens, we can begin to ask questions like, who is included or excluded when we say Asian American, or AAPI, AAPIDA? Whose history are we taking into consideration? Whose experiences are being overlooked or ignored? Are more Asian Americans purchasing guns? Or is it more Asian American men? What does gender have to do with it? I hope you will sit with these thoughts as we welcome words from our panelists. And I want to begin with our co-authors, Professor Wildman and Professor Armstrong. Can you talk about how the first edition of Privilege Revealed identified and described privilege, and what has changed in the 25 years since the initial publication?
Thank you, Adam, for giving us a lot to think about. I'm old enough to recall when we said the personal is political. Maybe we still say that, I don't know. But let me follow in that personal vein by focusing first on myself as a white person, not because I'm particularly proud of that fact or not proud of that fact. It's just that it is a fact, even though I have had the experience of people assuming that I was not white because of the content of my scholarship about race, gender, social justice, and privilege. But I'm naming whiteness because I want to encourage all of us, but especially white people, to learn more about race and racialization in the United States. And I want to provoke a greater consciousness of whiteness and its role in this race story. So this is not a guilt trip, but rather just a plea to notice white racial privilege, the benefits that we as whites receive without even realizing it. Well, and we may never be able to fully understand the privileges that whiteness brings. One privilege being not to notice race or not to notice white privilege, and another to forget about it even once we have noticed it. But noticing is at least a first step towards fostering that awareness. And of course, there are many other privileges that intersect with race privilege, because we as humans share many concerns. Can I pay my rent or my mortgage? Can I feed my family? Can I protect myself and the ones I love from COVID? And can I get health care if I need it? Humanity is our commonality, but systems of privilege draw unfair lines, stacking the possibility of addressing these concerns against some social groups. And society does group people by visible and not so visible identifiers across categories that are intrinsic to people's identities. So categories like race, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, physical or mental ability, religion, many other categories. We could go on. Society has made these categories matter in a way that having thin fingers or crooked toes does not matter in terms of housing access, food, or healthcare. And all of these identity strands can stack the access to human needs against or for a person. So the book used the image of a koosh ball. It's a toy that was popular when we first did this. And I don't know if I'm frozen because the koosh ball isn't showing up, even though I'm waving it around in front of the camera. But it's a ball, so-called, but it has strands of identity. So it shifts. I mean, sometimes one of these categories might be more important to you. And another time, another one might be. Maybe being an eldest child in the family is part of your identity. But all the all the strands share the fact that the holder of the privilege is often unaware of it and can opt out of struggles over oppression because of it. They can say, I'm tired of this, because they don't have to live with being on the downside of the power line all the time. So spend some time noticing the privileges you do hold rather than the ones that you do not. And in terms of, you asked also, Adam, what has changed? I think over 1,000 people signed up today for this webinar. So there is a community interested in this topic. At the same time that examining privilege or theories of race and racialization, like critical race theory, were even outlawed by the federal government.
Yeah, so to pick up on what Stephanie's been saying with respect to what's changed, we're now in a place where people have been willing to acknowledge inequality and question why it's so prevalent in the United States, despite the demise of formal and explicit discrimination in law. So exploration of the systemic nature of privilege and disadvantage has expanded from something that was explored primarily in academia to some prominent media outlets, such as the New York Times or the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and the New Yorker, looking at issues of privilege and its entrenchment in society. They are somewhat highbrow journals in terms of not necessarily representing the broadest spectrum of American life, but the discussion is out there. And from an academic perspective, in terms of what's changed with respect to privilege, there's a number of work that has, or a number of articles and studies that have highlighted the numerous human identities and characteristics that are subject to privileging or subordination. And there have been a lot of attempts to examine, as you mentioned, Adam, how these identities intersect and deflect or heighten disadvantage. The past year has provided an object lesson on how privilege and its absence are matters of life and death in the United States, well, throughout the world. Pacific Islander, Latino, Indigenous, and Black Americans all have a COVID-19 death rate of double or more than that of white or Asian Americans, who are experiencing the lowest of the age-adjusted rates. So who's had the means to isolate and hold on to their work, minimizing exposure to the COVID-19 virus? Who needed to keep working with the public? Excuse me. And what was the rate of contracting the virus among those workers? Whose children were able to attend school, maintain their educations online? What schools are reopening? The answers to all of these questions require us to look at how systems of privilege determine access to the stuff that's the basic needs of our lives.
I really love where we're going, and we're just starting off. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Margalynne. I want to maybe continue down this thread, Margalynne, that you're posing. So, Margalynne, if you want to add on to it, or John as well, definitely want you to chime in. Can we continue to illuminate some of the ways modern day privilege harms society? So we definitely looked at where do we start off? What's changed over the past 25 years? What hasn't? And again, Margalynne, you were speaking to some really concrete examples and very matter of fact, life and death. But if there are other thoughts or examples that come to mind, and of course, John, please piggyback after.
I would say that privilege is nothing less than a threat to democracy. Privilege is manifest in the mindset of a sizable number of people who've acted on their belief that they and only they have the right and power to determine who's American, who gets the right to participate in our democracy. Perceptions of privilege are fueling current attempts to keep people out of the voting booth, out of government institutions, and out of sight. I mean, particularly with respect to people who are transgender. So the idea that privilege is entitling people to control society, and perceptions of privilege are fueling, well, let me stop. A belief in having a privileged status enabled the former president to urge his followers to shut down Congress and to stop the constitutional process of certifying the election of the president and vice president. And just yesterday, the Washington Post reported that the arrested insurrectionists are 95% white and 85% male, and that counties with the most significant declines in the non-Hispanic white population were the most likely to produce the insurrectionists who were arrested. So these people typically hail from places where non-white populations are growing fastest. And so the idea of preserving the privilege that having a white and a male, often a status, has really fueled a lot of the trauma the country is experiencing with respect to what happened at the in the aftermath of the election. John?
Stephanie Martin. I don't know what that was, but anyway, Stephanie and Martin and I are longtime friends, and it was a delight to go back and look at the book again. Of course, it also reminded me of our great friend and love, Trina, who passed away, who also did a chapter with Stephanie. So anyways, it's good to be in your company, even if it's only visually. I think these situations are complex. I've actually written a book, and I cite Margalynne and Stephanie profusely in terms of trying to unpack and think about privilege. So I think privilege is not one thing, it's many things, and that we're actually looking at privilege with entitlement. So just to give you an example, you can't tell because I'm sitting down, but I'm 6'3", 6'2", 6'3". I used to be closer to 6'5". Age is catching up with me. But one of the things we know in our society is that for every inch you're over 6 feet, the expectation is that you will make $150,000 more in your lifetime. So that's height privilege, right? But it doesn't have the same kind of perniciousness and boundary protection that whiteness does. So there are a lot of ways in which privilege is circulated in society that doesn't have the same protective edge to it that whiteness does. So in some ways, whiteness is more than just the people are getting benefits, and it may be unrecognized, maybe unsolicited. in many ways, what we see is hoarding of those benefits. What we see is sort of the protection and fighting for those benefits. So on one hand, it's denying that they exist. On the other hand, it's a huge fight to maintain it, as January 6th indicated. But two other quick things. One, one, I would say privilege is coming with a certain amount of entitlement, and it's organized in the larger society. It's not just an individual expression or individual experience, even though it may be expressed individually and experienced individually. There really is something greater. Excuse me, asked my Black students at Cal a few years ago after the Trayvon Martin was killed, if they had been in that situation, would they have called the police? And not one of them said they would, right? So they sort of understand that there's a larger social structure behind the individual actions and choices. Think about the situation in Central Park where the white woman called the police on a Black man. She knew what she was doing, right? She threatened him with that. I'm gonna call him and tell them you're a Black man, and knowing that triggers a whole bunch of responses, including the collective response of the state. So I think that on one hand, we're talking about personal experience, but we're actually talking about something that's enduring and more deeply entrenched as well. The one thing and I won't belabor it, but I'm one of the co-founders of a group called Perception, which was one of the early groups that started working with implicit bias in the mind science, along with some other colleagues. And in my own work, I sort of reject the notion that everybody's racist. I think we live in a racialized society, but part of it depends on how we define racism. And as we sort of go over the literatures, and racism really only gained currency in our popular discourse in the 1930s. But as we go over the discourse, what racism means keeps changing. And what it should mean keeps changing. So I think it's an open discussion. In my mind, what's clear is that we have a deeply racialized system, and people are distributing that system differently, and people defend that system differently. The last thing I'll say is that I'm reminded of James Baldwin when he says there's no hope for them as long as they think they're white. And what he's saying by that is that, yes, whiteness is a social category, but it's a social category replete with anxiety, replete with violence, replete with disassociation. And if you attach yourself to that category in sort of a certain way, you get invested in all those things. And so what he's saying, as long as they think they're white, he's saying as long as you think you're part of that elite club that has the right to be everything associated with whiteness in the most pernicious sense, if you feel like you're entitled to that, then there's no hope for you or us, right? And he's not suggesting, I don't think, that you can just sort of say, okay, I'm not white, right? But I think to sort of hold that position and recognize the fluidity of it, and recognize the situatedness of it. A great example, and I'll stop, is that there's a big debate right now whether or not Latinos will be eventually white or not. The jury's out. And not only is there a jury out in terms of whether they will be white or not, but what behind that is what will whiteness mean in the future? Will we have a different position? So it's not just who will be in the category, but how do we define the category, and will the category have different meanings? And it's clear to me it will. It's not clear what those meanings will be, but it's clear it will be a different meaning. And so one question is, can it be in relationship with other groups where it doesn't need to exercise and hoard privilege or entitlement?
Oh my goodness, I am really vibing off of the energy, the comments here. I want to quickly kind of ground us so far because we're about a third of the way through and realizing that people might have also hopped on a little bit later. But we've so far talked about kind of examining privilege through academia, through policy over the past almost 2-3 decades. You guys have given really concrete examples, privilege in terms of wealth, privilege in terms of race. John gave privilege in terms of height. And again, just recognizing the intersections of it all. Who biologically reaches 6 feet or taller? How does gender come into it? How is this all built in structurally again? I want to ground us back into, all right, we've talked about privilege a bit. Maybe we can talk about what can the privileged do. Maybe if I can turn this back to Margalynne and Stephanie, given the harms caused by systemic privilege, as we've been discussing, threats to democracy, what can people of goodwill do to is it combating privilege? Is it, again, these steps and calls to action to recognize it? We are acknowledging that people are calling out privilege more often now. But what are the next steps here? Margalynne, I'll go to you.
Sorry, I started talking without my microphone being on, but there's a certain amount of power that accompanies privilege, and the way that people use that power can be positive in terms of inviting other people to the table, or in terms of challenging the advantages that being perceived as having privilege gives to you, and kind of questioning openly whether or not it is at the expense of other people. So examining whether your status as privileged is something that's harmful to other people, because it's not necessarily harmful to other people. But if you can make that question or ask yourself those questions about how is my privilege operating in my immediate world, and what can I do to try to neutralize or even overcome the detrimental effects of it. I just heard someone tell a story about her son who goes to school in a very privileged school district that has some students, primarily students of color, who come to the school on the basis of a consent decree. And her son was friends with a boy who was coming to the district, and they were friends at school, but she would never authorize a play date. And she was told that the friend of her son's talked about the fact that he was in 5th grade and no one had ever invited him home after school. And, obviously this child observed what was happening and how he was being excluded, and was kind of brave enough to express his pain. But she had to reflect on, why hadn't I exercised my power to invite this child over? And part of it was because she was afraid that her child would be invited to his home, which is quote unquote across the tracks, and she was afraid of that. But even in terms of acknowledging what she had done to people in a kind of public space, she was beginning to, check her privilege and to take the first steps towards eliminating some of the pain that privilege had caused another human being.
I want to follow up on what Margalynne is saying in terms of how to combat systemic privilege. So many things, but I think that, as Margalynne said, trying to start by being an ally to the person on the non-privileged side of a power dynamic, might start by just all of us looking around at the spaces that we inhabit. Who's in the room or who's in the virtual room? The person who you need to be the ally with might not even be there, for starters. And you can be an ally by asking why. Why aren't they here? How can we get them here? Or if they are there, if a person is there, check in, sit with them. When we get to sit together deflect attacks if that person is being attacked, not as a savior. You're not a savior, but you're an ally. You want to take your cues from that person in terms of what do they need to thrive in that environment. In the book, I think we quoted Sheila O'Rourke, who is a white lesbian who offered some practical advice for those with privilege. She suggests that give up a little bit of the privilege by speaking out against othering that's not directed at yourself, and thus being an ally to the person on the downside of the power line. So she describes this approach as practicing on other people's oppression. So she, being white, tries to intervene whenever she sees a racist interaction or exclusion. And she hopes that someone else will speak out if it's a sexist aggression or a homophobic interchange that occurs. So she will not have to take the lead in that instance. So, you know, if you're educated, support public schools, ask politicians who ask you for money, what are they doing for those who don't have your privileges? You know, just so many examples.
I just want to add that, you know, we can take steps towards being allies, but we don't get to call ourselves allies. The people who we are reaching towards are the ones who decide who's going to be our ally, who has shown enough support. And I just want to say that because it's important to not think that because we have a privileged status and we're trying to work at undermining the power of that privilege, it doesn't mean that it's noblesse oblige or something like that in terms of reaching out to others. You make efforts and attempts, but if somebody wants to become your friend, it's of course up to them, and it's not you to decide as the privileged person. So that idea of really having to examine what we're doing in terms of opening doors and making gestures, but ultimately letting people have their own agency.
You guys are bringing up, for me, the power of love. We're talking back to Stephanie's initial comment about the personal being political. Here we are segueing into, you know, what's the harm, what's the damage, what can allies, potential allies do? And we brought up here, Margalynne, friendship. It sounds maybe cheesy or, you know, too out there, but really when we're looking at our personal relationships, our family, our friends, and extending that relationship beyond to our neighbors, our religious community, our school community, there are relationships and friendships forming. I have a 5-year-old. I've fostered a middle school student for a couple years, and I am realizing that media, especially children's media, is trying to address this this concept of a rainbow friendship in all shapes and forms. And I see this much more prevalently these days. So Privilege Revealed, the book itself, also talks about friendships, also talks about the trophy friend. And I'm wondering, John, if you want to kind of segue us into this conversation for a bit, and Margalynne, if you want to follow up afterwards. But what is it about allies, friendships? What are lessons that we can take away about, you know, again, reaching across the aisle? What should we be wary of? What should we be aware of? Anything and everything.
Well, these are great questions and complicated questions, and we only have a short period of time. So let me just sort of give you some highlights. One, I think the power issue is relevant, and I have a piece coming out that's talking about how in much of our discussion around bridging and belonging, we've bleached out the question of power, and power matters. And so implicit in what you're saying, Adam, is that the privilege in a certain situation has more power. Not that the person who's less privileged doesn't have power, but that shifts. I mean, to some extent, privilege is situational. I should say, and people will know who follow my work, I take a critical perspective of allyship, because I think if we're not careful, it could create sort of another stratification. If we're trying to create a space where people belong, and partnerships, and as you said, deep friendships. And Margalynne is right. It's like someone doesn't get to decide to be my friend, but I don't get to decide to be their friend. And I would even go further and say part of the issue is not friendship. Part of the issue is power. And I oftentimes say be hard on structures and soft on people. And instead, we do the opposite. We're hard on people and soft on structures. And one of the things that Margalynne and Stephanie talk about in the book is essentially being structurally blind. We call it colorblind. We don't see all the different practices that reproduce hierarchy, pain, and benefits to some at the expense of others. And so I think, while we actually have practices of bridging and bringing people together, it's important, but it's not nearly sufficient. These structures reproduce that, and we have to really pay attention to that. And what I was saying about allyship is that ultimately, I want someone, if I'm in a struggle, I want someone who's sort of invested in that deeply themselves. They're not doing it just for my benefit. They're doing it because they understand they have a stake in it. This is a bit complicated, because in saying that, I'm not saying they should appropriate it. I'm not saying that, white men should go off and lead the road to racial justice for the rest of us, right? And so it's complicated what I'm saying, or nuanced, I should say, what I'm saying. But neither do I want them just to sort of say, I'm going to help you in your fight. Because, and again, I think you say this in your book, Stephanie and Margalynne, realizing that one of the hard edges of privilege is really white supremacy. It's really, so oftentimes we focus on the group that's being disadvantaged in some way, right? It's like, how do we help you? It's like, get your knee off my neck. That would help a lot, right? I mean, and then I can help myself. So sort of ignoring the relationship, especially in universities. It's like, I'll help a student get in, I'll help a faculty member get hired, but the structure stays the same. And so it's not that we shouldn't do those personal things, but that's limited.
Yeah, well, there's often what we can individually do is somewhat limited. And the idea of the structures as being the real target of our efforts, I think, is absolutely right. But one of the things that we have to do with respect to of dismantling structures is to understand them, and to help people understand how those structures are either immoral or unfair or just harmful to our general ability as a country or as a people to make a forward kind of progress in which we are helping everyone to pursue their potential. One of the things that I find most tragic about the history of our country is how much potential was wasted by the discrimination, by the legal barriers. How much has the structure of white supremacy deprived humanity of the efforts of really capable people who would have been able to contribute had they been given a fair chance. And so, in terms of why people should look at dismantling the structures, it's because it just harms all of us. It harms our future. And even though there might be some immediate gains in kind of supporting the status quo, in the long run, it looks like the human race is kind of headed to destruction because the status quo is doing so much to harm the earth as well as the earth's people. And that's another subject, but let's think about what changing the structures can do for all of us.
I'm going to continue on this vein of thought. This is how we do it. I do want to kind of continue to open up questions from the audience. And so reminder to listeners that if you are following along, either tracking your own comments or would like to pose questions to this panel live, use the hashtag #AskOBI. So we have a few questions coming in, and I'm going to do kind of a 2-for-1 situation. One of the questions we have is representative democracy the best solution in dismantling structures of privilege and power? And also this question of how do we move beyond discussions of privilege and move to systems of change? So we're talking systems, no doubt about it, larger macro stuff here. But if I can quickly chime in to say, I don't want to discount or assume that we've moved beyond discussion of privilege, that there is a lot of power and a lot of relationships built in change by having this discussion. We're not done yet. I know I'm not done with it in my community for sure. But even in recognizing something like representative democracy, we have to acknowledge that conversations are also privilege. Language is also privilege. Asian Americans, AAPI have long recognized the barrier of speaking with our parents, our elders, because this cultural language barrier exists within our most immediate community. That might not always be the case for Black and white people. And so, once we start getting into conversations of structural change and who's represented and who's invited along for the ride, until we get address some of these ongoing hurdles, we might lose people on the journey, and I want to be mindful of that. But this is opened up now. The questions again were just like, is representative democracy the best solution? How do we take our conversations to systems change?
With respect to representative democracy, whether or not it's the best solution is a pretty difficult question, because I don't know that we've ever really experienced it. So many people have been deprived of the ability to participate. It would be a wonderful experiment to have everybody who's entitled to vote to actually be able to do it. What's going on now, particularly in Georgia, is all about excluding people from participating. And when we had a lot of people participating through the work of someone like Stacey Adams, the results were fairly remarkable in terms of how enthusiastic people were when they believed that they would actually be able to have a voice. So before I discard it, I'd kind of like to try it.
Following up on that, I feel like I'm always channeling Mari Matsuda when I talk about this, because obviously we've been talking about the history of this country where it hasn't really been a representative democracy. But Mari would say, but look at the words that, let's hold them to those words about equality and justice. And they're it's pretty good words if we actually could act upon them. And we don't know yet if we can, but it seems like a worthy effort.
Stephanie, we don't know what we mean by representative democracy necessarily, but the idea of democracy is that people govern themselves. And the United States have always been ambivalent in terms of when it says we the people, is who are the we and who is a person. That is the penultimate question that the country is still facing. And what they did is to pick out several groups and say, you don't count. I mean, Dred Scott wasn't even subtle. It said, Blacks can never be part of the political community, whether you're free or otherwise. And you have no rights given by the Constitution. Only rights you have is that which ones white people are inclined to give you. So is that representative democracy? The point is that we should be deciding what kind of country we have, what kind of world we have. It is up to us collectively to do that. It's not someone else inviting us into their show. This is our show. We are part of the country. We're part of the planet. And so I think the privilege of being able to pick who comes in and who stays out is one of the most ultimate privileges to have. And it happens at schools, it happens at hospitals. And if I can just tell a 90-second story, I'll just share. My sister-in-law called me a couple of weeks ago, and she said that her nephew, this is in Detroit, the largest Black city in the country, her nephew had dialysis and needs a kidney transplant. Because he lost his job, because he got COVID, Martin talks about Black people more likely to get COVID. Because he got COVID, he was fired. Because he was fired, he lost his insurance. Because he lost his insurance, he was taken off the dialysis list. So my sister-in-law, who lives in Detroit, and my brother is a manager of buildings in Detroit, so he's well connected. They called me in California. Can you help? And I won't go through the whole story, but I was able to call the hospital. I know the president of the hospital. He's back on the list. And he didn't lose his place on the list. And I was thinking about this. This is privilege, right? And this is privilege that probably whites more often have. And I have this privilege of helping my nephew. But it's problematic because why should someone have to go through that? What if someone who doesn't have that connection? So I'm aware of trying to use the privilege for quote unquote good, but I'm also aware that the structure of the privilege that I can is extremely problematic, and I have done nothing to disrupt that.
We have time for a couple more questions, and I'm going to do my best to squeeze these in. We've talked about allyship. We've talked about coalition building. One audience member brings up denying facts seems to be one of the ultimate privileges in this day. And so much is choosing not to educate ourselves. How do you go about conversations? How do you go about addressing this level of privilege? How do you even call this out if it's almost kind of almost thrown in our face, like, I know I can do this and I know I can get away with it. But I think it's just this question of like how to combat alternative facts. What do we do with this?
Yeah, there's people who have the choice about whether or not they have to deal with reality. And it's difficult to reach somebody who has the ability to not have to respond to the pressures of real life and to make the kind of choices that people who aren't so situated have to make. And so I think that in some ways you have to just try to keep pushing, even though you realize that it might not be a war you can win. Derek Bell wrote about the kind of permanence of racism and of people who were facing a lot of oppression that they couldn't really change, still got some fulfillment out of pushing. And he tells this story about this elderly Black woman in the civil rights era who wasn't going to live to see the system change. She knew, but she kept resisting. And she said, Derek Bell quotes her as saying, well, I lived to harass white people. And that was just something that has stuck with me over all of these years, because in a way, despite being unable to topple the system, there was that self-actualization and even some joy from trying to push wherever she could to make the system have a harder time maintaining itself. And so in terms of actually being able to make people face up to the fact that there are not alternative facts might be impossible, but you can't stop saying, well, that's not real, and here is what's actually happening, even if it doesn't change their mind.
I want to, because that was a fantastic response, I'm going to ask a couple more. I want Stephanie, John, Margalynne, you should know there are so many audience questions coming in that we are doing our best to kind of filter, but also I'm going to do my best to combine a couple. So again, continuing with our 2-for-1 deal. It's a blowout sale today, guys. So how can we become mindful enough to avoid granting privilege? So if this question is also making me think. Privilege can be inherited, privilege can be granted. How can we impact culture by again this task of avoiding? It's like withholding the power to give privilege. Is that possible? Is that feasible? What does it look like? And then there's this follow-up question as well, that maybe we can't completely put aside privilege, but we could possibly use it for higher will, higher change. But again, I think it gets back to the conversation of who decides all that, right? Yes. Anyone want to jump in there? Stephanie?
I want to give you all an example from children's books, which is the world that I have tried to enter. And this is based on a study of books published in 2018. In children's picture books, there were more characters who were animals than there were people of color. Think about that. 50% of the characters in books were white, 27% were animals, 23% were all the other people of color combined, and that number does not even describe misrepresentations, misappropriations, or stereotyped characters. So when we talk about facts, there is a way in which the world is being portrayed to people as what that world is that starts very early. So I do think supporting schools and education in a way that isn't a school to prison pipeline, but actually provides education is a really necessary step that we need to look further at. What are we teaching children? How much would we gain if we didn't privilege whiteness starting there?
Certainly individually, people can purchase those books that have good representations of people of color, because a lot that happens in our society is driven by markets. So is there a way to help manipulate those or use them to your advantage or to the advantage of equality?
Even Kendi has posited that, first of all, we need to be anti-racist, not enough to be non-racist. But secondly, what he says is that whenever there's huge disparities, it's a powerful indication that something is wrong. So whenever we have the halls of power populated by white men, and women are missing, and gays are missing, and it's like people of color missing, bells and whistles should go off. So that sort of tells us that whether it's who's going to these elite schools, who's going to the data matters. It doesn't tell the whole story, but it matters. And that's especially important, Adam, in terms of your question, because in terms of the unconscious, we can't become fully conscious. This is one of the hubris that, as people learn about the mind science, it's just that I'm going to think really hard so I get rid of all of my bias. It won't work. We can't get rid of bias. It's the way the mind works. And bias is not something that happens between our head. Bias is actually reflecting what's happening in the large society. And so we have to do multiple things. And I would say when I push for structure, I'm not saying it excuses our individual acts. I'm saying we have to operate at multiple levels. In the United States, we default to the micro individual level. And that's not unimportant, but that will never do the whole thing. But I'm not saying ignore that, allowing us to be mean and disrespectful to people because we work on the structural level. The last thing I'll say is that in terms of how we use our privilege, that matters. I'm a professor at Berkeley. There's a lot of privilege and power that goes along with that. So should I resign? Should I quit? Or can I use it to try to open up doors to others? I don't think I can completely, nor should I even try, completely get rid of every aspect of my privilege. I'm not going to become, hopefully, much shorter. Maybe I will. But I can try to use the privilege that I have, one, to name it, but two, to also use it for those who are opening up doors who are less in a powerful position.
Thank you so much, John. I want to pose one final question, and panelists, please treat this as your opportunity to also close out with our audience. Audience members, you have been so fantastic. Obviously, this is not the conversation didn't start here. We're literally just this little peg along the trail, right? But that what we're seeing on social media today, with all of your interaction, that you will continue to hold these conversations within your own spaces, within your own networks, within your own following. So please continue to do that. You know that we're going to be rooting you along the way and checking in as well. So final thought. Again, piggybacking off of the anti-racist philosophy. Given what we've discussed today, are we seeking a world without privilege, or are we seeking something that's opposite to privilege? What would that even be? What's opposite to privilege? This is an audience question. Or otherwise, in your own words, your final thoughts and closing out with our panel today. I will open it up to Margalynne, Stephanie, John. I want you to go last.
Well, I think the opposite of privilege is something along the lines of equal access. And so when we look at people who have education, we don't want people not to be educated. We just want education to be an option for whoever wants to pursue education. And being privileged in terms of certain identity issues, well, it would be good if identity issues weren't necessarily privileged, and that you were respected no matter what your sexuality or gender identity is. And so the opposite of privilege is simply not excluding people because of them not being born with access.
And I just want to give a plug to John's book, which I was lucky enough to read in manuscript form, Racing to Justice. You should get it. You should read it. You should read everything he puts out. John, you should not quit your day job. You've opened so many doors for so many people and continue to do so. So thank you for that.
I know we're just out of time. There's a if you excuse it, there's a Greek myth called the golden bough. And the gist of it is the gods give the king and queen this golden bough to produces all of these wonderful bounties for the whole community. They're trustees for the bough. And as trustees, they get something extra. But it's not theirs. It belongs to the people. But they're just administering it for the people. And the myth goes, at some point, they decide it's for them. It's not for the people, it's for them. And then it becomes a plague. So if you have something and you think it's only about you, there's a saying, my father's a Christian minister, he used to say, your gifts in life is God gifts. What your gifts are is God gifts to you. What you do with your gifts is your gifts to God. And I think sometimes we hold on to them. We think it's this, I'm smart, I'm rich, I'm this. And so it all is personal. It all belongs to me. There's not always an opposite word. So think about it. And that speaks to the asymmetric nature of power. So the N word, what's the opposite of the N word? There's not one. And so I think that to some extent, privilege is one of those words where we can talk about non-privilege. but it's not quite right. And the last thing I'll say is that it's not enough to stop discriminating. We create structures and systems to do something. So we want a society that's fair, that's inclusive, that's belonging, that's loving. We need to affirmatively design systems and structures to do that. Not simply to say, let's stop discriminating, but let's design the structures to do what we want them to do for all of us.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you to you and OBI for having us. On behalf of our entire panel, Stephanie, Margalynne, John, thank you to the audience for tuning in and sharing with us an hour of your afternoon. And that's a wrap. This was amazing. The audience felt like this was just the tip. This was not enough. We need to have more, and we will. Thank you all. It's an honor to know all of you, and we'll see everyone again.